The lung ventilation rate is defined as the amount of air inhaled in a specific period of time. This measurement can be calculated by timesing the tidal volume and the ventilation frequency. In other words, you can think of the lung ventilation rate as the tidal volume, which is the volume used in respiration, for example, alveolar surfaces, times the ventilation frequency, which is the amount of times someone goes through ventilation per minute. There are many different factors that can affect the rate at which one goes through lung ventilation. To make this easier to understand and to examine the effect of each of these factors, here's a short example. To view these ideas, we will look at how different factors affect the ventilation rate of Joe. To start off, Joe is in an environment where there is no seen environmental factors affecting his ventilation rate. Now let's examine which factors would affect the rate at which he ventilated. If Joe was to be found in an environment where there was less O2 or oxygen, that means there would be less O2 and oxygen present in Joe. This would cause an increase in ventilation rate. Additionally, if there were higher levels of acidity present in the system of Joe, his ventilation rate would also increase. Finally, if Joe was to be in an environment or surrounded by a higher level of carbon dioxide or CO2, his ventilation rate would also increase. Now you might be wondering, how does this increase in ventilation occur? Well, there is a series of steps for which the body of Joe will go through in order to increase his ventilation rate. To easier explain this, here's a few pictures. To start off, the carotid body, which is a small cluster of chemoreceptor cells found in the carotid artery, detect changes. Once these chemoreceptors measure how the blood content is changing in an individual, they relay a signal to a portion of the brain in order for change to occur. The portion of the brain that receives this signal is the medulla oblongata, specifically the medullary respiratory center. This respiratory center is responsible for controlling the rate and depth of respiratory movements of the diaphragm and other muscles which are responsible for the ventilation rate in an individual. After the brain receives the signal, it processes it and sends it to the lungs and diaphragm through interstitial muscles. The rate of ventilation is then changed through the amount of inhalation and exhalation. Inhalation is an active process in which a negative pressure system is created. This decreases the pressure in the pleural cavity and in the alveoli. Exhalation is typically a passive process in which as much air is pushed out as possible from the lungs. When the carotid bodies sense either a decreased level of O2 in the blood or an increased acid or carbon dioxide level in the blood, they will send the signal to the medullary respiratory center, which then stimulate the increased contraction rate of the diaphragm, therefore increasing the rate in respiration. After Joe's blood level returns back to normal CO2, carbon dioxide, and acid concentrations, the carotid bodies will no longer be as active. This would cause the respiratory centers to no longer receive the messages they were earlier, so therefore the diaphragm would no longer have an increased rate of contractions. This would cause Joe's rate of respiration or ventilation to return back to normal. These processes allowed Joe, along with the rest of mankind, to be able to control the rate at which they ventilate in order to maintain homeostasis.